we might be wondering from there, what about the derivatives of other trig functions? So remember, sine and cosine aren't the only trig functions. There are a bunch of other ones that are kind of derived from the sine and cosine. So for instance, there's the tangent, which is the sine over the cosine. There's the cotangent, which is sort of the reciprocal of the tangent. So it's the cosine over the sine. And then we have also the secant and cosecant. So remember that the secant of x is going to be 1 over the cosine of x. And the cosecant of x is going to be 1 over the sine of x. Okay. So we don't know yet what the derivatives of any of these functions are, but because you can see that all of them just involve the sine and the cosine, we can use the quotient rule for all of these to find out what the derivatives are. So I'll work through the derivative of the tangent of x, and then I'll leave the other three up to you to see if you can find the derivatives. So if we want to take the derivative of the tangent of x, this is going to be the same as taking the derivative of the sine of x over the cosine of x. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is say which one is sort of our g and which one is our h. So we'll call sine of x our g of x, and we'll call cosine of x our h of x. Okay, and so g prime of x is going to be the cosine of x, okay, and h prime of x is going to be minus sine x. So that's both of those derivatives just come from the stuff that we did before with finding the derivatives of sine and cosine. So from there, what we can do is kind of plug these values into our formula for the quotient rule. So remember, the quotient rule in general is sort of like this. If we take the derivative of any quotient of functions, so we'll call it g of x over h of x, this is going to equal g prime of x times h of x minus g of x h prime of x all over h of x squared. Okay, so we just need to take these functions that we kind of defined here and plug them into this formula. So so the derivative of the tangent of x is going to be, so g prime of x, so that's cosine of x, okay, times h of x, which is also cosine of x, minus g of x, which is sine of x, times h prime of x, which is minus sine x. Okay, so minus sine x. Okay, and then that's going to be all over h squared. So that's going to be cosine squared x. Just remember that cosine squared x, this can also be written as cosine x squared. There's no difference. It's just a typographical difference. Okay, so let's try to simplify the numerator here and see what happens. So cosine of x times cosine of x is going to be cosine squared of x. And then we have sine of x times sine of x, which is going to be sine squared x. But then we have these two negative signs, so this is going to be plus sine squared of x. And then all over cosine squared of x. Okay, so Remember the trig identity, cosine squared plus sine squared, or sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So then we can rewrite the numerator just as 1. So it's 1 over cosine squared of x. And remember up here, 1 over cosine is the secant. So 1 over cosine squared is going to be secant squared of x. So the derivative of the tangent function, the first derivative of the tangent function, is going to be secant squared function. Feel free to rewatch this as many times as you want, and then when you're feeling up to it, try to find what the derivative of the cotangent, the secant, and the cosecant are, kind of using a similar method.